A family can steal more than money, they can steal status, identity, and the right to exist in the story they profit from. In one meeting, a sister cuts someone off like a policy change, and a father tries to keep it smooth by demanding compliance instead of fairness. Then comes the final insult, they don't even handle it themselves. They send a stranger to escort the rightful heir out of the room, out of the legacy, like they never mattered. There's a saying people live by. When they show you who they are, believe them. So what happens next? Take the quiet exile to keep the peace, or flip the entire game overnight, and let consequences do what respect never could. Before we dive into today's story, let us know where you're tuning in from. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. And if you'd like to stay with us for the next chapter, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. Now I'd like you to hear what he's been carrying in his heart. And when I say I'm going to tell you everything, I mean the part that happened before that stranger ever touched the door handle. Before my sister's polished smile. Before my father's shrug of a sentence that landed like a verdict. Because that moment at the table didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of years of being quietly filed under not necessary. I'm Zephyr Zeph Whitlock. I'm 31. I live in Bend, Oregon, where the air smells like pine and clean snow and nobody cares what your last name used to mean. My home office sits at the back of my place like a control tower, 2 monitors, a wall calendar. I actually use a locked drawer for contracts and a second locked drawer for the things I hope I'll never need. Rookline Supply Systems grew in that room not with champagne toasts or family applause, but with spreadsheets late nights and a kind of focus that doesn't ask permission. 8 years of building quietly turned into a logistics empire worth just under $900 million, and I never once brought that number home. Not because I was hiding out of shame. Because in my family, money isn't a number, it's a leash. If they knew what I'd built, they wouldn't have celebrated me. They would have claimed me. They would have treated my success like community property. So I kept the boundary clean. Bend was mine, the Whitlocks were a name on old paperwork, a thread I didn't pull unless I had to. In their story, I was the one who moved away, the one who got private, the one who didn't show up for every dinner or pretend to care about their legacy talk. They told people I wasn't involved anymore, like it was a mutual choice, like I'd opted out of love. What they didn't say was what I'd kept running behind the curtain. Their lives were still plugged into systems I designed. Not their pride, not their speeches, their actual lives. Insurance premiums, education funds, the maintenance payments that kept the Newport place from turning into a museum with a leaky roof. A couple of cards that never declined because I'd built a dependent structure inside a trust framework that looked like old family wealth from the outside and looked like a clean machine to me from the inside. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself it was mercy. I told myself I was keeping the peace by staying invisible, by letting them think the lights stayed on because they deserved it. The truth is, I'd gotten used to being useful in ways that didn't require respect. Then the envelope showed up. Cream-colored, thick stock, no logo, no return address. Just my name written in the kind of careful cursive that used to make teachers think my mother was elegant and made me think she was angry without saying so. I didn't open it at the door. I carried it into my office like it was evidence. The card inside was clean and formal family strategic meeting. Not dinner, not reunion. Your presence is requested. Requested, not wanted. Strategic, not sentimental. Newport, Rhode Island. Next Saturday. Business casual. My phone buzzed before I even set the card down. Evelyn. Be calm. Let Sloan lead. Don't make this harder than it has to be. The exact phrasing hit me like a pre-recorded warning, like she'd practiced it in a mirror. Another message slid in right behind it. Sloan, keep it neutral. No bold suits. Denton's bringing partners. Let's keep the room clean. Don't try to outshine anyone. I stared at that line, outshine anyone, and felt something old and bitter rise up behind my ribs. They weren't asking me to show up as a son. They were asking me to show up as a prop. I turned the envelope over in my hand again, not because I needed to read it twice, but because something about it felt wrong. In the bottom corner, pressed into the paper, was an embossed seal. Not Whitlock stationery, not a family crest. A law office mark from Rhode Island, subtle but real. My mother didn't own an embosser like that. and the handwriting close similar, almost a perfect match, had a different rhythm at the ends of certain letters, like someone copying a signature had gotten the shape right but missed the muscle memory. The invitation wasn't just sent to me, it was staged for me. My stomach tightened, not with panic but with clarity. So I did what I always do when something feels staged. I checked the systems. I logged into my internal dashboard, the one that sits above the normal banking apps, the one that makes the world look like connected pipes instead of separate accounts. There was a security alert waiting like it had been holding its breath. An attempted access request on a sub-account tied to the Whitlock Legacy Trust structure. Unsuccessful, but not invisible. The attempt had fingerprints, device identifier, timestamp, and a location ping that didn't match Bend. It didn't match anywhere near me. It matched the East Coast corridor, close enough to Newport to make my jaw lock. I didn't reply to either text. Not okay, not see you then. Silence was the only thing they'd ever respected from me, so I gave them more of it on purpose this time. I called Morgan Hale, my assistant, who used to be a corporate auditor and still thinks like one even when she's ordering lunch. She answered on the first ring because she always does. Run a full dependency map, I said. Every path between our structures and anything tagged Whitlock. I want the sub-accounts flagged, I want the authorization trails, and I want the last 90 days of access attempts pulled and frozen. She didn't ask why. She didn't need the story. She heard the tone. Got it, she said, already moving. Then I opened the second locked drawer, the one I rarely touch. Inside was a manila folder with black marker on the front in case of war. Patents, contracts, ownership proofs, system logs, screenshots of wire transfers routed through shell entities designed to keep my name off their gratitude. It wasn't revenge. It was a seatbelt I'd installed years ago because something in me had always known the car might crash. I slid it into my bag and sat there for a minute listening to the house hum. The heater clicked. My coffee went cold. Outside, Bend kept being Bend, calm and indifferent. And I made the decision that changed everything. I wasn't going to Newport to beg for my place. I was going to Newport to confirm what they were trying to do to my legacy and why they suddenly needed me in the room when they'd spent years pretending I wasn't part of the picture. The flight to Rhode Island was short enough to be ordinary and long enough to feel like a countdown. Airports always make people equal sweatshirts, backpacks, tired eyes. But the moment I stepped out of baggage claim and into the rental car lot, the old Whitlock world started creeping back in. I drove the coastal roads into Newport with the windows cracked, salt air cutting through the recycled car smell. The mansions rose behind iron gates like they'd been sitting there forever, watching people come and go, deciding who belonged. It was beautiful in the way a museum is beautiful, polished, curated, cold. I got there early. 5 minutes, maybe 7. Not because I was eager. Because I learned a long time ago that if you arrive on time in a room that's already decided your role, you'll spend the whole meeting catching up to what you missed. Early gives you angles. Early gives you silence. Early lets you see how people behave before they remember they're being observed. The Whitlock place in Newport looked exactly like it always had, and nothing like home. Manicured hedges trimmed too perfectly to be alive. Gravel drive that crunched like a warning. Windows tall enough to make you feel small from the outside. I parked off to the side on purpose, far enough to leave if I needed to. No one came out to greet me. A staff member passed by, gave the polite, empty nod you give a guest whose name you aren't supposed to say, and kept walking. I stepped inside, and the first thing I noticed wasn't the chandeliers or the antiques. It was the way the house had been reconfigured. The formal dining room wasn't a dining room anymore. It was a boardroom costume, long table, projector screen, printed agendas, nameplates lined up like little flags claiming territory. My eyes scanned the table without even meaning to, searching for something basic, my name. It wasn't there. An assistant, someone I didn't recognize, too young to remember me, smiled like she was following instructions. "Mr. Whitlock," she said, and gestured down to the far end near the double doors. "Your seat is right here." It wasn't like the others. Lighter wood, no armrests, the kind of chair you bring in when you're short to place setting. In front of it sat a blank card and a pen angled toward me like an assignment. "Write yourself in. Prove you exist." The humiliation wasn't loud. That's what made it sharp. Loud cruelty is easy to call out. Quiet cruelty makes you question whether you're overreacting. I didn't touch the pen. I didn't fill in the card. I sat down exactly as it was because the emptiness in front of me said the truth more honestly than any of them would. A child's voice cut through the room before the meeting even started. Who is that? It wasn't whispered. It was curious and blunt the way kids are when adults haven't taught them to perform kindness. A woman nearby, some cousin by marriage I couldn't place, laughed too quickly and answered like she was brushing dust off furniture. Oh, he used to live on the West Coast. Not my brother, not my son, not family. A location, a past tense. I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my face calm. I'd built a $900 million company without flinching under pressure. I wasn't going to crack because someone tried to reduce me to geography. From my angle at the end of the table, the room's power lines were obvious. People leaned toward Sloane without realizing they were doing it. They laughed right after she smiled, not because the joke landed, but because she'd signaled it was safe to laugh. Denton Price sat with a laptop open, but his eyes kept flicking to Sloane before he spoke, like she was holding the remote control to his mouth. Sloane moved through the room with that effortless confidence she'd practiced her whole life. Touch a shoulder. Here, say a name there. Keep the elders warm. Keep the younger ones hungry. She looked at me for less than a second, and that second wasn't recognition. It was inventory. I was an item she'd placed at the edge of the room and wanted to keep there. The meeting began with the kind of polished talk that sounds like leadership but is really choreography. Legacy, stability, future planning, protecting the family. Words that can mean anything when you don't attach them to facts. Then the packets came around. Everyone's had staples. Mine didn't. I flipped through it slowly, page by page, letting the quiet in my head do what it does best. There was no mention of me. No acknowledgement of any contribution to the financial architecture I knew was holding their everyday life together. No reference to the operational fixes I'd suggested years ago. Worse than omission, though, was the rewrite. In a section summarizing past decisions, I saw ideas that had once been mine described as unanimous council resolutions. No author, no origin. Just a clean narrative where the Whitlocks had always been wise on their own. They weren't forgetting me. They were scrubbing me. They were laundering history. My eyes tracked the slide deck as Sloane clicked forward, and for a split second I caught a note tucked in the bottom corner of a slide, small, easy to miss, not meant for the audience reallocation ready. Acknowledgements prepared. That wasn't family language. That was legal language. That was execution language. I felt my pulse slow, not speed up. Because fear makes you sloppy. Clarity makes you precise. My phone buzzed against my thigh under the table. A message from Morgan, short and surgical. Last night, a device attempted to reset access on a Whitlock-dependent account. Location pings in Newport. Attempt failed. Trail saved. My fingers curled once, then relaxed. So it was real. Someone here was trying to move inside my structure. Someone here thought they could touch what I'd built without me noticing. I didn't speak. I didn't object. Not yet. Their whole plan depended on me reacting like the version of me they remembered, emotional, defensive, eager to be heard. I wasn't that version anymore. I watched who passed papers to whom. I watched Denton slide documents in and out of folders like he was dealing cards. I watched Sloane guide the room with tiny motions, the same way a conductor guides an orchestra without ever lifting her voice. When the break came, I excused myself in the most boring way possible, like I was going to the restroom to wash my hands. The hallway outside the dining room was lined with portraits, generations of Whitlocks frozen in oil paint with their confident smiles and tidy lies. I walked past them slowly. Husband and wife, father and son, daughter with pearls, a wall of perfect belonging. There was no space for me, not even as a footnote. I stopped in front of one family portrait where I should have existed somewhere at the edge, and the absence hit me like a physical thing. This wasn't about my seat at a table. This was about deleting me from the record so they could tell the story of their legacy without the inconvenient truth of who actually funded it, who actually built the infrastructure that kept it breathing. I stepped into the restroom, locked the door, and pulled out the folder from my bag, in case of war. The paper felt heavier than it should have, not because it weighed much, but because it carried years of choices I'd made to stay quiet. I didn't open it all the way. I didn't need to. I just needed to feel it there and ask myself one question. What proof do I need before I stop protecting people who are actively erasing me? When I left that restroom and walked back toward the dining room, the house felt the same, but my role inside it had changed. I wasn't here to be included. I was here to witness the crime they were dressing up as family planning and to make sure that when the world eventually asked what happened, I wouldn't be answering with feelings. I'd be answering with documents. When I walked back into that dining room, it didn't feel like returning to a meeting. It felt like stepping back onto a stage where everyone else had been rehearsing while I was in the hallway, reminding myself to breathe. The same chandeliers, the same polished wood, the same nameplates lined up like little claims of ownership. Mine was still a blank card and a pen I refused to touch. The difference was in me. I wasn't here hoping they'd suddenly remember I mattered. I was here to confirm exactly how far they were willing to go to erase me and to find the weak seam in the story they were trying to stitch over my life. Sloane clicked into the next section with the smooth confidence of someone who'd already decided the ending. She called it legacy restructuring, and she dressed it in soft words that sounded responsible if you didn't look too closely. Optimization, stability, future-proofing, protecting the family. Every phrase was a blanket meant to cover the same sharp object control. The slides were clean, minimal corporate in the way old families like to pretend they're modern. But the arrows always pointed the same direction, away from anything that could be challenged, toward whoever could sign the papers without asking questions. My father sat there like the meeting was a weather report. Harlan had always been like that when something mattered in a way he didn't want to admit. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He just used short sentences like scissors cutting off conversation before it got to the bone. My mother, Evelyn, was quiet in the practiced way she'd perfected over decades, hands folded, eyes lowered expression, soft enough to look kind while saying nothing that could ever be held against her later. If you needed a witness to your pain, she would never be it. A cousin, one I hadn't spoken to in years, cleared his throat and asked politely what my role was in all of this. He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at Sloane like she was the only one authorized to answer. Sloane's smile didn't waver. She leaned forward just enough to appear gracious and said, "Zeph isn't involved anymore." The room shifted the way it does when someone says the quiet part out loud and expects you to accept it with a nod. My father didn't even lift his eyes from the packet in front of him. He just mumbled, "Don't make this harder than it has to be." That sentence wasn't an opinion. It was an instruction, a cue. It told everyone what the rules were. I could exist in the room as long as I didn't complicate the narrative, as long as I didn't ask for proof, as long as I didn't claim what was mine. I felt something tighten in my chest, but it wasn't rage. Rage would have been a gift to them. Rage would have made me loud. Rage would have made me look unstable on whatever camera they had tucked in a corner. What I felt was a clean kind of recognition. These weren't spontaneous lines. They were written into the plan. Sloane says I'm not involved. Harlan reinforces it. Evelyn stays silent. Denton records it. The family nods. Paperwork follows. I sign. I disappear. Sloane clicked again. A chart filled the screen, branches of assets, flows, trust lines, distributions. Everything was labeled with neat little boxes, like a family could be reduced to a diagram. For a fraction of a second, my name appeared on one of the branches. Zephyr Whitlock. Just long enough for my eyes to register it. Then it flickered and changed to a label that felt like a death certificate, inactive/transferred holdings. It was so fast most people probably missed it. But I didn't. I saw the wipe animation, the way the font shifted, the way the slide didn't hesitate as if nothing had happened. That was the point. They weren't just excluding me privately. They were training everyone in the room to accept my disappearance as normal, like I'd never been part of the structure. Like the blank card at my seat wasn't cruelty, it was truth. Now the missing pages in my packet made sense. The rewritten past decisions made sense. The careful language in the invitation made sense. They weren't pushing me out. They were removing evidence that I had ever been inside. Sloane kept talking, her voice warm, her hands moving like she was guiding a charity luncheon instead of a quiet execution. She thanked those actively engaged. She praised the people carrying the vision forward. And then, like she was offering me a bone, she introduced the next segment as an exciting step into innovation. "We've brought in a strategic consultant," she said, turning slightly toward the far side of the room. "Someone with experience building scalable systems for modern family enterprises." Harper Voss stood up. The sound of the chair scraping the floor cut straight through me. I knew that name. Harper had worked close to one of my projects years back, close enough to understand the architecture, close enough to learn the language we used internally, close enough to see how our systems moved money and inventory like water through pipes. I hadn't spoken to Harper in a long time, but the last time I did, the conversation ended with polite compliments and a request for just a few examples of our workflow that I refused. Watching Harper now, I saw the way their posture was slightly too upright, the way their smile was measured, the way their eyes scanned the room like they were checking for approval. Then for a brief second, Harper's gaze caught mine. There was hesitation there. Not guilt, exactly. More like a flicker of recognition that whatever this was, it wasn't clean. Then the flicker vanished, swallowed by the calm expression of someone who'd already accepted the terms of a deal. I didn't move. I didn't react. I held my face steady and let my brain do what it does when someone tries to sell me my own work. I began collecting. Harper started speaking about digital transformation and supply chain transparency, using phrases that sounded right to anyone who didn't build systems for a living. My attention stayed on the little details, the way Denton Price's hands hovered near his laptop as if he was ready to open a specific file. The way Sloane's pen tapped twice when Harper said the word ownership. The way my father's mouth tightened the moment Harper referenced the family platform as if he was bracing himself for the part where someone might ask questions. Then Sloane called for a short break. People stood, stretched, drifted toward coffee and small talk. No one came to me. No one asked how I was. My absence was so normal to them that my presence had become scenery. That was fine. Scenery can move unnoticed. I stood quietly and walked out. Not toward the restroom this time, but toward the side corridor I remembered from childhood where my father used to disappear when he wanted to feel important. The thinking room. The door was slightly ajar, like someone had been in a hurry and assumed no one would follow. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and expensive wood polish. The desk was neat, the way men keep their spaces neat when they want to look disciplined. A drawer was cracked open just a fraction. I told myself I wasn't snooping. I was verifying. There's a difference when your name is being erased on a screen 10 feet away. I pulled the drawer open slowly. Files organized by color labeled in a precise hand. Denton Price's system. I found a folder marked Will's Archive. My fingers stayed calm as I lifted it. Inside were copies dated and tabbed. I opened the older one first. There I was, Zephyr Whitlock, listed in a section tied to technology-related holdings and specific dispersals. The language wasn't sentimental, it was exact. It reflected reality. The family's modernization efforts had been funded and structured by someone with technical knowledge. Then I opened the more recent version. My name was gone. Not moved, not reassigned, not separated into a different branch. Just gone. Like a paragraph had been deleted and no one thought it needed an explanation. I stood there holding the pages like they were a piece of my own skin that someone had peeled off and thrown away. The sting wasn't legal, the sting was personal. You can fight paperwork. What hurts is the ease with which people decide you're disposable. I took out my phone and snapped clean photos, every page, every date, every signature block, every subtle change in formatting that signaled a new draft. I captured the file code on the tab. I captured the timestamp on my own device. I did it the way Morgan taught me: assume someday you'll need to prove not just what you saw, but when you saw it, and that you didn't alter it. Then I slid the folder back exactly where it had been and closed the drawer to the same cracked position. I left the room the same way I entered it, not hurried, not guilty, just quiet. In the hallway, I opened my secure messenger and sent Calder Finch a message with only what mattered. I have documentation of will revisions excluding me. Photos captured with timestamps. Prepare timeline package. Maintain quiet mode. Activate pre-litigation IP protection at warning level. No escalation until I instruct. Then I texted Morgan Start compiling full transaction histories by beneficiary. 2018 to present. Include dependent sub-accounts, auto payments, insurance, education funds, estate maintenance. Package as individual reports. Lock them. I didn't need revenge. I needed the record. When I walked back into the dining room, Sloan was already at the front again, voice floating over the room like a ribbon. People were laughing in the shallow way they laugh when they think the hard part is done. Harper was flipping through notes. Denton was adjusting his laptop. My father was staring at his packet. My mother was smoothing an invisible wrinkle in her sleeve. No one noticed I'd been gone. That was the thing about being treated like nothing. You learn how to move like a ghost. And ghosts see everything. I sat back down in the nameless chair, my face calm, my hands steady. Sloan kept talking about the future. But for me, their future had shifted. What had looked like a smooth plan now looked like a structure built on a weak lie. And I'd found the cracks, altered documents, erased history, and a consultant who shouldn't have had access to my language. They weren't just pushing me out of a legacy. They were trying to steal it on paper. By the time Harper took the floor again, the room had changed. The early morning politeness had drained away. People weren't speaking as loudly. The smiles were tighter. Everyone was watching everyone else the way people watch when they know something significant is being decided and they don't want to be caught on the wrong side of it later. Sloan stood near the screen like she belonged there. Denton sat with the posture of a man holding a trap closed. My father barely moved. My mother remained perfectly still, a statue carved from manners. Sloan introduced Harper with a tone that tried to sound casual, but nothing in that room was casual anymore. Harper Voss has helped design scalable digital frameworks for complex holdings, she said. Today, Harper will present the next phase of our digital rollout through Whitlock Future Holdings. I hated the way she said those words. Whitlock Future Holdings. As if slapping the family name on something made it theirs by birthright. As if you could rename a machine and claim you built it. Harper dimmed the light slightly and brought up the first slide. And there it was. My work dressed in someone else's colors. A dashboard interface, familiar layout, familiar hierarchy. A workflow diagram showing intake, sorting, optimization, fulfillment routing. A dynamic inventory balancing model. A real-time exception monitor. The font was different. The palette was colder. The icons had been swapped out for sleeker ones. But the bones were mine. The logic was mine. The order of operations was mine. Harper spoke with confidence that sounded practiced, but the vocabulary gave them away. They used internal phrasing I'd never put into public documentation. Terms we used inside Rookline because they were shorthand between people who built the thing. A phrase from a training module. A specific way of describing route compression that only made sense if you'd been in the room when we named it. My stomach didn't drop. It hardened. Because now I wasn't guessing. I was watching someone demonstrate knowledge they shouldn't have had. Harper clicked forward and began explaining how the platform would integrate with estate operations, how it would optimize vendor management, how it would streamline family-controlled properties. A few relatives nodded like they understood. They didn't. They were nodding at confidence, not comprehension. That was always the Whitlock way. Then Harper pulled up a data flow chart. And in the corner of that chart, so small it was almost invisible, I saw it my watermark. Not a logo. Not a name. A technical signature I'd started embedding years ago after a competitor tried to lift one of our internal training decks. It was subtle, a specific naming pattern, a sequence marker, an odd little symbol we used in our documentation that could be traced back to our system design standards. I'd built it like a fingerprint. Most people would never notice it. I noticed it instantly. My suspicion became certainty. This wasn't inspiration. This wasn't similar ideas. This was mine. Harper kept going, highlighting features, showing a demo clip describing performance improvements. As they spoke, I watched Denton Price. He wasn't watching the screen. He was watching the room. He tracked reactions like a man measuring risk. Each time Harper referenced ownership, Denton's eyes flicked to Sloan. Each time Sloan nodded, Denton's shoulders eased as if he'd been granted permission to breathe. Harper clicked to the next slide and moved too quickly. Just a fraction too quick. And that's when I caught the second detail that made the hair at the back of my neck lift. In the lower corner, a file reference flashed for half a second. A path label. Technical, not meant for display. It contained the word Rookline. Not Whitlock, not Future Holdings. Rookline. It was there and gone so fast that anyone else would have missed it. But I live inside systems. I see patterns in motion. That one detail told me more than any speech Harper could deliver. They weren't just copying the concept. They were working off a build, a deck, a file, a structure that originated in my environment. Which meant one of two things: someone had exfiltrated materials from my system, or someone with access had handed them over. My phone vibrated again, quiet against my leg. Morgan. One-line token attempt detected. Dependent environment. Timestamp matches Harper demo. So while Harper was performing my work in front of my family, someone was actively trying to prove it ran right then, right there, testing access, attempting to activate a token as if the meeting itself was part of the deployment. The arrogance of it hit me like a cold splash. They weren't scared of me. They were confident I was a blank card at the end of a table, a person who could be erased by a label on a slide. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I didn't inhale sharply. I didn't shift in my seat. I didn't whisper to anyone. I became still the way you become still when you're watching a trap close and you want to remember exactly how it happened. Instead, I collected. I marked the timestamp on my watch when the watermark appeared. I noted the slide number. I memorized the phrasing Harper used around key features. I watched which relatives leaned in and which ones looked away. I watched the moment my father's hand tightened on his pen when Harper mentioned patented optimization, because my father knew what that word implied even if he didn't know the patent belonged to me. I watched my mother's eyes drop to her lap when the room applauded like she couldn't fully meet what she was helping do. Harper ended with a calm line about modern stewardship. Sloan clapped first, a clean leading clap that told everyone else to follow. The applause spread on cue. It wasn't appreciation. It was confirmation. A room signing off on theft without having to read a single contract. In the middle of the clapping, Denton leaned in to murmur something to Sloan. She didn't respond with words. She responded with a small nod. That nod wasn't about the presentation. It was about the next step. My phone was still in my hand under the table, hidden by the folder I hadn't opened. I typed one short message to Calder Finch: increase IP protection to soft lock. Prepare pre-litigation warning. Maintain quiet strategy. Timestamp everything. Then I slid the phone back into my pocket and let my face return to neutral. The room was still applauding. Harper was smiling. Sloan was already turning back to the agenda like the performance had simply been one more bullet point. I sat there in the chair with no name, and I let the conclusion settle fully, not as emotion but as fact. They were preparing to turn my company's technology into a family asset in a single day using a consultant, a lawyer, altered documents, and a room full of people who benefited from my silence. They weren't asking me to join their future. They were trying to erase me from it while keeping everything I'd built. And the worst part was how calm they were about it. How ordinary they made it feel, like stealing from me was just another Whitlock tradition. I didn't clap. I didn't smile. I didn't argue. I simply watched because I understood something that none of them did. Yet the moment they decided I was unnecessary was the moment they handed me the cleanest reason to cut the cords they didn't even know existed. The applause died the way it always does in rooms like that, fast obedience swallowed by paper and procedure. Sloan didn't linger in gratitude. She didn't ask if anyone had questions. She just slid right into the next item on the agenda, like the performance had only been a warm-up act for what she actually came to do. Denton Price stood, adjusted his cuffs, and lifted a stack of folders with the careful reverence of a man holding something that could change lives if people bothered to read it. The air shifted again. Less family, more closing table, Just formalities, Denton said, voice calm, practiced. Acknowledgement documents. We want to ensure everyone understands the restructuring and that the record reflects awareness. Folders moved down the table, stapled, tabbed, labeled. People accepted them with polite nods like they were receiving holiday cards. When mine landed in front of me, it didn't feel like a document. It felt like a trap set gently on a velvet pillow. The cover page looked harmless enough, generic title, neutral language, my name printed cleanly as if I still belonged in a sentence. If someone skimmed only the first sheet, they'd think it was an informational disclosure. That was the point. The real teeth were buried. I opened it slowly, not for drama, but because I'd learned that speed is what people rely on when they want you to miss what matters. Inside, the language tightened. Paragraphs got denser. Cross-references multiplied. Somewhere past the soft opening lines about awareness, the document turned into what it really was, a surrender disguised as a signature. There it was in plain legal English, tucked into the middle like a knife in a bouquet. I acknowledged that I was no longer involved in the family's operational decisions. I affirmed that I had no ongoing claims. I confirmed that any transfer, reallocation, or consolidation of holdings was voluntary and unchallenged. Voluntary, unchallenged. The words sat there like they'd been waiting for my name. My eyes lifted for a second, flicking to Sloane, and I finally understood why she'd made sure to say it out loud earlier, why she'd done it in front of witnesses with that polished smile. Zeph isn't involved anymore. She'd laid the verbal foundation, so this paper could look like the natural next step. A clean chain, a reasonable narrative. If this ever landed in court, they'd point to the meeting, the slide, the statements, the signature, and shrug like it had all been my choice. I kept reading. An appendix on confidentiality followed, written with the kind of broad scope that can wrap around a person's throat without them realizing it until they speak. It included non-disparagement language with penalties large enough to scare anyone who didn't have my resources. It wasn't just a gag order. It was a threat wearing a suit. If I spoke publicly, if I contacted partners, if I warned anyone, they could paint it as a breach and try to punish me for telling the truth. They weren't only trying to erase me. They were trying to silence the space where my name could reappear. I turned another page and saw a section that made the muscles in my jaw lock. References to the logistics platform, warehouse automation scripts, inventory optimization processes described as if they had been developed within collaborative family project parameters. Collaborative, family, project. The words were so wrong they almost looked ridiculous on paper. But that's the danger of legal language. It doesn't have to be true to be effective. It only has to be signed. I tapped the page lightly with my fingertip, not to draw attention, but to ground myself. Across the table, Denton watched me with a stillness that felt like anticipation. He wanted me to react. He wanted me to argue. He wanted me to make it emotional so he could label me difficult. I didn't give him that. Instead, I asked one small question, the kind that sounds curious instead of accusatory. When you say collaborative family project, what's the scope you're referring to? Denton's answer came too quickly, too smoothly, like he'd already rehearsed it. To avoid misunderstandings regarding sources of capital and resources, he said we need all parties to confirm the origin and development context. Sources of capital. He didn't say it like an explanation. He said it like a warning. If I pushed, they'd pivot. If I pushed, they'd start asking why my money moved the way it did, why my structures existed, whether I was a risk. They'd smear the foundation not because it was unstable, but because it was theirs to weaponize. I could almost hear the future headline they wanted: disgruntled son disputes, family legacy amid questions of funding. That's what Denton's phrase meant. It meant they'd already planned to make my credibility the battlefield if they couldn't keep the paper battlefield clean. I kept my expression neutral, like I was still weighing it. In reality, I was indexing every loaded word: voluntary, unchallenged, collaborative, non-disparagement, penalties. Those weren't paperwork details. Those were the bars of a cage. Around me, pens clicked. Pages turned. People signed without reading. My aunt initialed something like she was checking a box on a hotel form. My cousin laughed lightly and said, "This is all so grown up, as if the consequences weren't real." Sloan watched the signatures gather like trophies. Then my phone buzzed once sharp against my leg. A message from Beck. It wasn't long. Beck never wasted words when he didn't have to. They promised me a seat in the new branch if I back them. I'm not signing anything. Watch yourself. I read it twice. Not because I didn't understand, but because it confirmed what I'd sensed all morning. This wasn't a family coming together. This was a deal being cut. Sloan was buying consent with access. They had already divided the spoils. They'd already decided who would be rewarded for silence and who would be sacrificed for convenience. I slid my phone back into my pocket and forced my breathing to stay steady. I didn't look at Beck. If I did, Sloan would clock it. She was too good at reading the room. I needed her to believe I was still stuck in my old role, still hoping, still unsure. The most dangerous thing I could do right now was let her know I saw the whole shape of the trap. So I kept reading, calm, deliberate, letting the paper show me the next move they intended to make if I refused to cooperate. The document didn't just strip claims. It laid out a story for why stripping me was reasonable. It framed me as disengaged. It framed the restructure as a protection. It implied that any objection from me would be disruptive, maybe even suspicious. It didn't say the words outright, but the architecture was there. If I fought, I would be the problem, not the theft. I made a choice in that moment. Not a loud one, a quiet, internal one. I decided I was not going to sign my own disappearance. Whatever they did next, they were going to have to do it without my consent. I lifted my eyes to Sloan. She was already holding a pen, rolling it between her fingers, like she was patient, like she was giving me a chance to do the right thing. She slid the pen toward me with a gentle motion that could have passed for kindness if you didn't know what it meant. It was a sentence offered softly. Sign and be erased neatly. Refuse and be removed messily. I didn't touch it. The room didn't erupt when I didn't pick up the pen. That's not how the Whitlocks operate. They don't shout, they suffocate. Silence settled over the table like a thin sheet pulled tight. Sloan's smile remained in place, but it sharpened at the edges. Denton Price's hands folded, then unfolded, as if he was restraining impatience. My father's gaze stayed down, fixed on his packet, like the paper could save him from witnessing what he'd helped create. My mother sat perfectly still, the kind of stillness that looks peaceful, until you realize it's refusal. I closed the folder slowly and placed it flat on the table. The sound of it touching wood was small, but in that room it landed like a gavel. I looked directly at Sloan. Not angry, not pleading, just steady. Explain this, I said, and tapped the section that labeled my work as a collaborative family project. Why does your paperwork describe my company's technology like it belongs to this family? Sloan didn't answer the content. She answered the frame. She leaned back slightly, hands open, voice warm enough to sound reasonable to anyone who didn't know her. Zeph, she said like she was soothing a difficult child, this isn't about credit. This is about stability, about stewardship, about making sure the family is protected moving forward, protected from what I asked. She let out a soft laugh that carried no humor. From uncertainty, she said. From confusion. From people misinterpreting what's been built here. Built here. The audacity of that phrase made my stomach go cold. She was standing in my work and calling it the floor. My father finally spoke, still not looking up. Don't turn this into a scene, Harlan muttered. You know what's at stake. At stake for who I wanted to say. But I didn't waste the breath. He wasn't going to be moved by truth. He was moved by control. I kept my eyes on Sloan. If this is just awareness, I said, why does it require me to waive claims and confirm transfers are voluntary? Sloan's smile held. Because that's how grown-up structures work, she said. We're formalizing what already is. What already is. She wanted that sentence to become reality through repetition. Denton cleared his throat and slid his own copy of the document forward as if to demonstrate transparency. The language is standard, he said. It ensures the record is clear. The record. That word mattered more than family in this room. They weren't trying to convince me. They were trying to create a paper trail that would outlive any argument I could make later. As Denton spoke, my eyes drifted past the table, not to be distracted, but because something had started nagging at me since Harper's presentation. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room near a decorative shelf that looked harmless, a small device angled toward my end of the table. It wasn't pointed at the center where Sloane stood. It wasn't capturing the whole room equally. It was aimed at me, at my chair, at my blank name card. It was the kind of placement you choose when you want one person's reaction more than the truth of the moment. They weren't just executing paperwork, they were building a behavioral record. If I raised my voice, if I slammed a fist, if I looked unstable for even a second, they'd have what they needed to justify cutting me out. They could stitch a story from my face and call it evidence. My pulse stayed even. I let my shoulders relax. I refused to give their camera a headline. Sloane tilted her head. "See?" she said softly, glancing around the room. "This is what I mean. It doesn't have to be hard. Hard. Again with that word. Hard was their code for resistance. Hard was any moment where I insisted I existed." Denton opened his laptop and I noticed his eyes flick to Sloane before he said the next part, like he needed the signal to proceed. He read from a prepared line tone neutral. "For the minutes," he said, "we're noting that one party is no longer a formal participant in the restructuring branch under discussion." He paused, looked at Sloane. Sloane gave a nearly invisible nod. I understood immediately what they were doing. They were shifting me from family member in the room to outsider on the record. If I wasn't a participant, then my objections could be dismissed as noise. If I wasn't a participant, they could remove me without calling it cruelty. They could call it procedure. My phone buzzed again, sharp, urgent. Morgan. Her message was short, but it hit like a door slamming. Urgent. Filing activity detected under Whitlock Future Holdings. Description matches Rookline internal materials. Looks like an IP-related submission or prep. Time sensitive. So while they were trying to make me sign away my right to speak, they were already moving to make my work theirs on paper somewhere else. They were trying to get ahead of me. They were trying to plant a flag in the ground before I could even say the word theft out loud. I didn't look down at the phone for long. I didn't want the camera to catch my reaction. I kept my face steady and moved my hand under the table like I was adjusting my cuff. I typed one message to Calder Finch, the shortest instruction that carried the most weight. Softlock IP now. Trigger protection clause. Pre-litigation warning quiet mode. Timestamp all. My thumb hovered for half a second, then I sent it. The room kept moving like nothing had happened because in their minds, nothing had. They still believed this was a contained space where they controlled the story. They didn't see the other board I was playing on. My mother shifted in her chair and finally leaned toward me close enough that her perfume mixed with the stale coffee smell in the room. Her voice was low, gentle, almost tender if you didn't know her patterns. "Zeph," she said, "please. Just sign, so this can be over." I looked at her. "Over?" I asked quietly. Her eyes flickered and for a second I saw something like fear. Not fear for me. Fear of inconvenience. Fear of the plan falling apart. Then she said the sentence that made everything crystal clear. "Sign and then you can live however you want," she whispered. "You don't have to be involved." There it was. They didn't need me as a son. They needed me as a signature. They needed my compliance to seal the folder and walk away clean. I sat back, letting the space between us widen again. My father still didn't look up. Sloane watched with that controlled patience, like she was counting down to the moment she could stop pretending this was voluntary. Denton gathered his papers with deliberate calm, the way a man does when he's about to move from persuasion to enforcement. He glanced once toward the double doors behind me. It was so quick it could have been nothing. But I'd spent years reading boardrooms, investors' negotiations, moments when a person has already decided the next step and is just waiting for the cue. And then I heard it. Footsteps in the hallway. Not the soft shuffle of staff. Not the light tread of family. Heavy measured steps that stopped right outside the doors like someone had been told exactly where to wait. Sloane didn't turn her head. She didn't have to. She lifted her hand slightly, the smallest motion, and Denton's mouth closed mid-sentence as if he'd reached the end of what he was allowed to say. The room held its breath. I didn't reach for the pen. I placed both hands on the edge of the table and stood up slowly, not as a threat, not as a spectacle, but as a reclamation of space. The chair scraped back an inch, and the sound cut through the silence like a line being drawn. I looked around the table at every face that had benefited from my silence and planned my erasure with polite smiles. I held my expression steady, refusing to give them anger, refusing to give them tears, refusing to give them anything they could edit into a story I didn't recognize. Outside the doors, the footsteps remained still waiting. I stayed standing, calm, unsigning, unowned. I stayed on my feet with both hands on the edge of the table, not because I needed support, but because I refused to let my body broadcast what my face wouldn't. The room had gone quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful. It was the hush that comes right before someone flips a switch. My blank name card sat in front of my chair like a joke that had stopped being funny hours ago. I could hear the ocean somewhere beyond the walls, but inside that dining room, the only sound was the soft, controlled breathing of people who wanted this to end cleanly. Outside the double doors behind me, the footsteps had stopped. Heavy, measured, not staff, not family. The kind of gate you hear when someone's being paid to enforce a decision. Sloane didn't look at me long enough to be called eye contact. She just tipped her head a fraction toward Denton Price, the smallest signal like she was cueing the next slide in a deck. Denton rose with that smooth, neutral posture lawyers perfect when they want to sound like a rule book instead of a person. He picked up a single sheet of paper from his stack and cleared his throat. For the record, he said, voice even. We're noting that one individual present is no longer a formal party to the restructuring branch under discussion. He spoke as if I'd already agreed, as if my silence was consent, as if the pen I refused to touch had somehow signed itself. His eyes flicked toward Sloane for confirmation, and Sloane gave a tiny nod, almost imperceptible, but deliberate. Like the meeting had a script, and she was the only one with the final draft. My father finally shifted, not to defend me, not to question the insanity of a family deciding a son could be removed from his own legacy mid-sentence. He shifted like a man preparing to endure inconvenience. Don't make this harder, Harlan muttered the same tired line he'd used all day. He didn't look up. He didn't have to. In his mind, the problem wasn't what they were doing. The problem was the chance I might not cooperate. I glanced down at Denton's papers and saw it right beside his folder, tucked close to the edge of the table where only someone seated at my end would notice. A separate form. Not part of the general minutes. A clean pre-printed document with a header and checkboxes, blank lines waiting to be filled in. Time, reason, witnesses. It wasn't a meeting note. It was an exclusion addendum. A template for documenting my removal, like it was routine, like it was policy, like it was something they'd planned long before I walked through their front door. They hadn't reacted to me refusing to sign. They'd prepared for it. The double doors opened with a slow, soft push, and a man I didn't recognize stepped in. He was dressed neatly, no tie, no visible badge, the kind of professional neutral that lets him blend into whatever role you assign him. He didn't scan the room. He didn't greet anyone. He looked straight at Denton like he was waiting for a cue. Denton gave the smallest nod. "I've been asked to escort you out," the man said. "No apology. No explanation beyond the line itself. You're no longer a formal party to this meeting." A few faces twitched. A cousin inhaled sharply and then pretended he hadn't. Someone's chair creaked. No one spoke up. No one asked what the hell was happening. My mother stared at her hands. Sloane's expression stayed composed, like she was watching a plan succeed. I didn't sit back down. I didn't argue with the stranger. I didn't give anyone the reaction they could replay later and call proof of instability. That camera in the corner was still there, waiting for me to be loud enough to frame me as the threat. I wasn't going to hand them that. I gathered my folder, slid it into my bag with steady hands, adjusted the strap over my shoulder. The movement was slow on purpose, controlled, the kind of calm that makes people uncomfortable because it refuses to match their narrative. Then I looked around the table, not searching for a lifeline, not pleading for recognition, just taking inventory. My father, my mother, Sloan, Denton. The relatives who benefited from the light staying on and the bills being paid and never once asked who wired the system that made it all possible. Faces I'd spent years trying to understand. Faces that had decided I was easier to erase than to respect. I let my gaze settle on Sloan last. Her eyes held mine for a beat, and I could see the satisfaction she tried to hide under professionalism. She thought she'd won by getting me out of the room. She thought the room was the whole world. I spoke once, clearly, evenly, so it would land in every corner without sounding like anger. You declared me unnecessary. The words weren't a threat. They were a conclusion, a clean summary of what they'd just done. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if they'd expected me to beg, to bargain, to plead for a seat. Instead, I gave them a sentence that sounded like a record, not a reaction. The stranger stepped aside to guide me, but I didn't need guidance. I walked out on my own heels, tapping lightly against the floor, past the portrait-lined hallway, past the polished surfaces that had always made me feel like I didn't belong unless I performed. The air smelled like citrus cleaner and old money. When I hit the front hall, the ocean air slipped in through a crack in the door, sharp and real, like a reminder that the world existed outside their curated walls. Out in the driveway, the wind off the water hit my face and cleared whatever warmth I'd been forcing into my expression all day. I got into my car and shut the door, and the silence inside the cabin felt different. It wasn't loneliness. It was space. It was the kind of quiet you need before you do something irreversible. I sat there for a few breaths, hands on the steering wheel, eyes forward. The part of me that used to twist itself into knots to keep the peace tried to speak up, tried to ask if I should give them one more chance. I didn't answer it. I'd already given them years of chances. They'd answered with a blank name card and an escort. They really believed the legacy was theirs. That was the coldest part. They truly thought they were removing a nuisance from their own plan, not kicking the foundation out from under a structure they didn't understand. They didn't know I'd seen the Rookline file reference on Harper's slide. They didn't know I'd photographed the will before and after my name vanished. They didn't know Calder Finch had already set a legal boundary around my intellectual property, quiet but active. They didn't know Morgan was packaging transaction histories that would explain in black and white exactly how their wealth moved. I started the engine and pulled out the gravel crunching under the tires like punctuation. I didn't lock anything that night. Not because I couldn't. Because timing matters. You don't swing a blade when people are still in the room applauding themselves. You wait until morning when the world starts moving again, and they realize the machine they depend on doesn't recognize them anymore. Bend greeted me like nothing had happened. That's what I love about it. The town doesn't care who your family is. The air was clean and cold the next morning, the kind of cold that makes the inside of your lungs feel awake. My kitchen smelled like coffee and toast. The only sound was the steady drip of the machine and the faint hum of my heater. My phone sat on the counter, vibrating like an angry insect screen, lighting up over and over with names I hadn't seen this often in years. I didn't pick it up right away. I poured my coffee. I stood by the window. I watched the pale light spread over the trees. I let myself be still long enough to make sure I wasn't acting out of adrenaline. I wasn't. What I felt was clearer than anger. It was a boundary finally drawn in ink. When I picked up my phone, there were already missed calls from my mother, my father, and Sloan. A couple from cousins who never called unless they needed something. I set the phone back down without responding and walked into my office. 2 monitors, clean desk, the calm order of a place built for decisions. I opened my secure messages first. Morgan's report was waiting, packaged the way she always packages, truth, precise, numbered, undeniable. Individual packets by beneficiary, 2018 to present. Source of funds, intermediary accounts, purpose tags, auto pay trails, insurance premiums, education funds, estate maintenance, portal access logs. Everything tied to the dependent architecture I'd built under the Whitlock name without attaching my own. Then another message from Calder Finch, IP protection active. Soft lock engaged. Any filing attempt under Whitlock Future Holdings now triggers an ownership dispute flag and preservation notice. Quiet mode maintained. I exhaled once slow and opened the Rookline administrative dashboard. Most people think money is numbers in an app. My world looked different. It looked like permissions pathways, dependencies, and rules that either allowed access or denied it. I navigated to the legacy trust structure, the branch that had been quietly supporting the Whitlock lifestyle for years, under layers they never bothered to understand because the outcomes had always been comfortable. The list of linked accounts populated on my screen, each one tagged with a name, a function, and a dependency path. My father's daily card, my mother's utilities, the maintenance account for the Newport property, the investment portal credentials tied to multiple family members, Beck's child's education fund, auto payments for insurance policies, vendor accounts, digital signature permissions they use to approve transfers as if the money originated from family brilliance. I selected the protocol I'd built for situations exactly like this, the one my lawyer once called excessive, financial revocation protocol. The system asked for two-factor authentication and a confirmation phrase not because it doubted me but because it was designed to prevent impulsive mistakes. I entered the codes. I typed the phrase. My fingers didn't shake. Step 1, revoke access. That meant credentials stopped working before money even moved. No logins, no portal entries, no approvals, no quiet workarounds through familiar screens. Step 2, freeze transfers. Anything scheduled or pending would stall. Not bounce with a dramatic message, just stop creating confusion and friction. Step 3, disable auto-renew and auto-pay. The invisible comfort items, the things they never thought about because they always just happened, would start failing quietly. Step 4, lock authentication rights. The final door. No bypass with a phone call to a banker. No, we forgot our password reset. Not without my authorization. I executed step 1. The dashboard updated instantly. Permissions flipped from active to revoked in clean red tags. I moved to step 2. Frozen. Then step 3. Disabled. Then step 4. Locked. It didn't feel like revenge. Revenge is hot. This was cold and orderly, like shutting down a building's power after the owners refused to acknowledge who paid the electric bill. Within minutes, the phone on my counter became a chorus. Calls, texts, voicemails stacking like debris. I didn't need to listen to know what they were saying. But the alerts coming through my monitoring panel told the story in real time. Card declined. Utility payment bounced. Portal login failed. Authorization error. Insurance premium rejected. Vendor account paused. Transfer blocked. It didn't happen in one place. It happened everywhere at once, which is how I knew the truth was finally visible. They weren't dealing with a single inconvenience. They were dealing with the collapse of a lifestyle that had been running on a system they never owned. Sloan texted first. Something wrong with Dad's accounts. Call me now. No hello. No apology. Just demand like the world existed to correct itself around her. My father called 3 times back to back. Then my mother. Then my father again. Then my mother again. The pattern felt familiar panic disguised as righteousness. At exactly 9 a.m., I sent one email. The subject line was neutral, almost boring. Access, termination, and ownership clarification. No insults, no emotional language. Just facts. I addressed it to every contact tied to the old structure family members, Denton Price, and any linked administrators. In the body, I stated what had happened and why in clean terms access had been terminated due to unauthorized attempts to reallocate holdings and misrepresent intellectual property as a collaborative family asset. I listed the effective timestamp. I referenced the relevant legal clauses. I offered one line about future communication going through counsel. Then I attached the truth package the way Morgan and I knew it needed to be packaged. Transaction logs. Wire confirmations, timestamps, side-by-side comparisons of the older and newer will drafts showing my name removed without reassignment, photographs of the slide sequence where my name was replaced with inactive/transferred holdings, A preservation notice and IP dispute letter prepared by Calder Finch, written in calm, firm legal language that would make any serious partner pause. I didn't need them to believe me emotionally. I needed them to be unable to rewrite the record. The responses came fast. Some angry, some pleading, some pretending to be confused, some trying to negotiate. I didn't respond. I let the documents speak. Late that morning, a call came in from a number I didn't recognize. It was my attorney's office. Local reporter reached out, Calder's assistant said. They're asking for comment on Whitlock restructuring. Your name is circulating. I stared at my screen for a moment, not because I wanted attention, but because attention changes the battlefield. It pulls private cruelty into public light. I gave one statement through counsel, short and clean. I am protecting my company's assets and correcting an inaccurate representation of ownership. That was it. No family drama, no mudslinging, just ownership and accuracy. Meanwhile, the consequences continued to unfold. The Whitlock Future Holdings project hit friction almost immediately. When IP disputes surface, serious vendors get cautious. Partners step back. Filings get flagged. Integrations pause. People who were ready to clap at a fancy presentation suddenly need indemnification clauses and proof. The thing they had tried to sell as a family innovation became a liability the moment the real owner drew a boundary around it. My mother left a voicemail. Her voice was soft, the same soft she used when she wanted to sound loving while delivering blame. "Zeph, sweetheart, we never meant for it to get this messy," she said. "You're making everything so hard. Can we just sit down like a family?" I listened to the first 10 seconds long enough to hear there was still no apology, only discomfort. Then I deleted it. Denton Price emailed with polished language about reconciliation, about emotional and financial recalibration, about everyone doing their part to restore harmony. He wrote as if we'd all made the same choices and landed here together. Calder responded for me with one sentence. "Family isn't a transaction. We decline." By afternoon, I changed my number. I closed the mailbox tied to the old trust structure, the one they'd used as a hidden pipeline when they needed help but didn't want to acknowledge where it came from. I created a new structure, quieter, cleaner, built around my criteria instead of their entitlement. The sun was already lowering behind the trees when I finally thought back to that dining room in Newport. The chair without a name. The blank card. The pen pushed toward me like a gentle sentence. The stranger at the door waiting to make me disappear with a polite escort. And I realized something that felt almost peaceful. They hadn't taken my family away. They'd taken the illusion away. The illusion that staying quiet would keep me safe. The illusion that paying in silence would earn me love. The illusion that blood automatically meant loyalty. Legacy, I understood, isn't what gets handed down to the people who know how to exclude. Legacy is what gets built by the person they tried to erase, the one who stands up anyway and decides what happens next. That night, I opened a separate file and moved a portion of my budget into a program I'd been considering for months, an incubator for founders who never get invited into the room where decisions are made. I kept my name off the plaque, off the press, off the credit. I didn't do it to prove anything to the Whitlocks. I did it because the best use of power is to make sure someone else doesn't have to beg for a seat the way I once did. The last thing I remembered before I shut my laptop was that blank name card. Not as an insult anymore, but as a marker. The moment they tried to erase me was the moment they finally gave me what I needed to choose myself without hesitation. And when the room finally went quiet, what stayed with me wasn't the money or the paperwork. It was the moment I realized I'd been treated like an inconvenience in my own bloodline. We all want to believe family means protection. But sometimes family becomes the place where respect gets traded for comfort. And silence is mistaken for peace. If this story leaves anything behind, maybe it's this: we don't have to become cruel to be strong. We can draw a boundary without losing our humanity, and we can choose dignity without turning our hearts to stone. There's a difference between revenge and reclaiming your life, and sometimes the kindest thing we can do for ourselves is to stop begging for a seat at a table that keeps moving. If you'd like, share where you're listening from or leave a few lines about a time you had to choose between peace and self-respect. And if you want to stay with us, consider subscribing so this can be a place you come to listen, breathe, and feel a little less alone. Thanks for being here.